Thank you all for joining us today. I'm really excited to have with us Ian Hathaway, who will be sharing a lot of his thoughts around startup communities and entrepreneurial ecosystem building. My name is Kate Harmon. I'm the Director of Cross-Campus Engagement for the Lundquist Center for Entrepreneurship. And on behalf of the Provost Innovation Initiative, in partnership with our Provost Innovation Student Fellowship Program, I'm really excited to have with us Ian, who our fellows have read the book, and I know this is going to be a great, lively conversation today around startup community. So I'd like to start by first introducing our guest speaker, and he has such an extensive biography that I will try to be condense it as we can here with a limited time. So Ian is an analyst, strategic advisor, writer, and entrepreneur. He has worked with leading organizations to solve complex problems, produce data-driven insights, develop new products, and shape competitive strategies. In addition to his research and advisory work, Ian has launched new ventures, helped young organizations get off the ground, and worked with established firms to expand into new markets. Ian has published for prominent research institutions, universities, businesses, and periodicals, and of course is a co-author of the Startup Community Way, which was released last year, which is one of the leading authorities around startup community and entrepreneurial ecosystem building. His research and writing is regularly cited in leading press outlets, including the New York Times, The Economist, Financial Times, among others. I know last month you were cited in Forbes for the work that you did in this book. So many publications. He's also a frequent contributor to outlets such as the Harvard Business Review, as well as the Wall Street Journal. Ian has advised organizations in the technology and media, startup and venture capital, financial and professional services realms, as well as the nonprofit and public policy sectors on a range of strategic, innovation, on analytical and content related matters. His clients have included large multinationals, high growth startups, leading investors and service providers, prominent research institutions and universities, and influential advisory organizations, and many, many more. Currently, he leads ecosystem development at Techstars, where he works with entrepreneurs, community leaders, and institutions around the world to support their paths towards building better ecosystems. Ian is an active startup advisor, mentor, and investor. He's an angel and LP at the fund. He is also a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and co-founder and board member at the Center for American Entrepreneurship. Ian holds a master's degree in economics and political economy from the University of Chicago and a bachelor's degree in politics and history from the University of Dayton. So again, thank you so much for joining us today, Ian. I'm really excited to have you with us. I thought we would start by having you highlight for the audience sort of the origins of how the Startup Community Way came to be. For those who in the audience who may be unfamiliar with your co-author, Brad Feld, Brad wrote the seminal book on startup community building way back in 2012 with his book Startup Communities, and where he identified and outlined roles of various stakeholders and organizations in startup community based in his own research and experience living in Boulder, Colorado during the 1990s and early 2000s. And this model, the Boulder thesis, has really become the model for how startup communities can think about going about building their own ecosystem. So maybe we start there in terms of having you share a little bit with the audience on your own relationship with Brad. How did the two of you meet? And then, how and why did both of you decide to write the Startup Community Way?
Yeah, happy to. Thanks, Kate, for that nice introduction and for inviting me to be here. I would love to be in Eugene in person today. It's been a couple of years, but obviously that's not going to happen. So we'll have to rain check that. How did Brad and I meet? Well, so Brad and I always joke. I say we're internet friends. We met on the internet. but really it's a testament to what a generous person he is. The values that he espouses in the book are not platitudes. They're actually the way he lives his life. I met Brad through a mutual connection of ours. There was some curiosity around some writing and research I did a few years back, and we just sort of stayed in touch and shared works, respective works and ideas. I interviewed him for a course I was teaching called Startup Cities. I was using his Startup Communities book as the textbook. It was based around case studies as well. And I interviewed him for best practices for accelerators. Brad is a very easy person to get a hold of. He will almost always respond to you in some way. And that's kind of from there it took off. I built a business in San Francisco that took me to London. I was advising, large tech and media companies generally, although my passion was in startups. And so here I am, had a successful entrepreneurial venture under my belt. I'm in London. I'm kind of feeling disconnected from the thing I wanted to do most. Reached out to Brad as a shot in the dark, and he said, "Here's my number." And we just started talking. And one day he called me up and said, "Look, I have an idea. I need to evolve some of the thinking around startup communities. A lot has changed since this book came out in a very short amount of time. You have a different kind of framework operating in your mind. I think we could come together and create something really cool." And it sort of evolved from there. That conversation happened in 2016. As I mentioned, I was in London at the time, went and spent a good chunk of 2017 in Boulder to build my relationship with Brad, to work together, and also to, really witness what a collaborative community like Boulder is really like. I'm happy to say that was a great experience. I learned a lot. Brad and I are now very close friends. And I can't imagine the work would have ended up where it did had I not done that.
Well, let's talk about that unique mindset, because that I think is the real key differentiator between the Startup Community Way and startup communities that Brad wrote back in 2012. Because you really, in the Startup Community Way, you take what you call a systems thinking approach to the book, and the way that you compare startup communities with complex adaptive systems. And you note along the sort of interrelationships between the parts and actions and processes in an ecosystem, and how it's really impossible in such systems to have or impose like a hierarchical sort of system of control. So maybe kind of talk a little bit about why this framework, systems sort of thinking type of framework, can be useful for startup community builders to start thinking about their own community.
Yeah, I guess because I thought it would be good to write an entire book about something that I knew nothing about before I started writing the book. So, I'm not a systems scientist. I am an economist by training, and we intentionally ignore systems dynamics in order to explain the world in a way that actually makes no sense at all, but can neatly fit in linear models. So the original intention was, in my head, a short version is, okay, let's take startup communities, the original version, let's make it a little more data driven and kind of framework based. Let's take a broader lens and make it more global, kind of tweak a few things. And that's actually the path we were set down. To begin, we wrote, I don't know, half a book, 30,000 words or so, pretty quickly. And then started kind of speaking more to grassroots organizers, other institutional actors who were engaging with startup communities. And I realized that what we were doing was not very good. It wasn't going to meaningfully move the conversation forward. And most importantly, it wasn't addressing the major disconnect that was occurring around the fundamental issues around collaboration, and why people are frequently disappointed with the results of this work, why things don't typically don't evolve the way that people want them to. Um, why there's exhaustion and fatigue. It takes forever. We don't even really understand these systems very well. So that's one thing. The second thing was I noticed this word ecosystem being thrown around. And then people, they would use this word and then sort of pivot towards things that completely ignored what the whole notion of systems are about, which is about the integration. So the little I knew, I started exploring that a little bit, about systems, and then I just like almost accidentally on a obscure environmental sustainability website was reading about this thing called complex adaptive systems, and I knew immediately that that was it. And I also knew that I knew nothing about that, and so it was a journey of just understanding that better and building that into this work. It was, it's first discovering, second understanding to a level that you can actually say something meaningful about it, and then third trying to wrap that around these practical concepts. Um, and so for a business book, a practical book, this is probably a little more theoretical than some people would like. For a business book, it's probably not evidence-based or correct enough for academics. We're probably somewhere right down the middle, and that's an okay place for us to be.
Absolutely. Well, I love the sort of anecdotes, that are sort of spread in there. So you provide the sort of, as you said, theoretical sort of background, but I love all this sort of interviews and um, discussions that you have in there from people leading university ecosystems to other, startup communities around the globe. So I think it's a really readable and valuable the book in that regard. Um, let's talk a little bit about sort of the one of the leading principles, if you will, around startup communities, which is that building a successful startup community really requires that they be led by founders, and specifically founders that have experience in building scalable, startups. Can you speak a little bit about, why it's crucial to have a founder-led startup community, and how a community can support or best support entrepreneurs in this regard?
Yeah, absolutely. There are a bunch of reasons for this, and it's really, emphasizing this as a response to uh, many times institutions try to control startup communities. Universities, economic development authorities, corporations, the list is long. It's well intentioned, but it leads to predictable mistakes. And that's essentially what our entire book is about. We say entrepreneurs as leaders. It doesn't mean that only entrepreneurs can play leadership roles. In fact, non-entrepreneurs play critical roles, especially early in the life cycle of an ecosystem, over a longer period of time, right? Many entrepreneurs drop out of participation, come back in, those kinds of things. Entrepreneurs also don't like dealing with a lot of the institutional actors that, if done well, it can bring valuable resources. And so you need some of those intermediaries. But regardless, a startup community that doesn't have a meaningful amount of entrepreneurs who are participating in decisions, it's just not a relevant or sustainable one. So the first thing I would just emphasize there is the relevancy. The second thing is the long-term nature, right? So entrepreneurship is, I don't know, it's like a vocation. It's like it's a lifestyle. Many entrepreneurs, whether they are active founders or not, they are going to continue working with entrepreneurs in some capacity. This is a lifelong thing. Some of them want other entrepreneurs to have an easier journey than they did, and they want to get involved in that action. I think for most people who work with founders or are founders, it's very exciting to be around. So they're going to have that necessary long-term view, which, frankly, this stuff takes a long time to materialize. And, people who are in it, we've been going through a big boom cycle in entrepreneurship. There's a lot of interest. that's also part of the reason why we decided to go with a framework approach, so that people had those principles right, rather than storytelling, which is something that needs to come. We need a lot more of that, so that we could sort of educate those newcomers about the realities of this. A lot of the things we talk about are second nature to entrepreneurs and community builders, but might be new sort of ways of thinking for these other folks. So it's that I really want to emphasize that long-term view, because it's essential. The third thing to say is that entrepreneurs are effective change agents. Like, that's literally what entrepreneurs do, is they get things done. So more than engaging, right, as inputs, more than the permanency that entrepreneurs will want to engage with the startup community over time, it's also, these are people with resources, with the frame, like the mental acuity to just get things done and drive forward progress. And so for all those reasons, it goes beyond the relevancy factor. Entrepreneurs know what other entrepreneurs need, but it's all of those things. And so to put it more simply, their entrepreneurs are the perfect asset. Not all entrepreneurs, some entrepreneurs are bad actors, unfortunately, but they're an unbelievable asset, to promote economic vibrancy through better startup outcomes in any community.
And let's kind of follow on that in terms of, one of the key things about entrepreneurs is the value they have with their networks. And you go into great depth in the book about talking about the important role that networks play in startup communities. You discuss how the quality of a startup community can really be directly tied to how well free-flowing of information is, and the interactions between its network. And so maybe you can talk a little bit more about why the quality of a community's network is actually more important than its size.
Yeah, so there's a belief around this, but there's also some amazing journal level academic research around this. Let me start with that, actually. So some researchers have established that it's sort of network structure, and who the influential actors are, that is more determinant of entrepreneurial success than the quantity of startups or the quantity of investors. More specifically, they label it this term deal makers. You can call it any number of things. We call it entrepreneurial leaders, but essentially these are the people who have experience, growing companies, leading companies. They're involved with many other companies. Sometimes that's as investors. Maybe they have an official seat on the board, but they're the people who know how to get things done. That's the thing. Information, knowledge, and that critical connections flows through this web. It's social capital driven. It's relationship driven. That's how things get done in a startup community. And so when the influential actors are those types of people that know what they're doing, they have access to the right resources, they have access to the right information and knowledge. When those are influential actors, good things happen. More specifically, when those people are collaborative with each other. So I'll use this example of Brad Feld. Brad is a hero in Boulder, and rightly so. You want your community to have a Brad Feld, and it's even better if you have more than one Brad Feld, and it's the best when you have all those Brad Felds, your version of that, working together to help entrepreneurs succeed. And that's really it. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah, and I think you described it almost like these individuals, these entrepreneurial leaders that have what you call super nodes,
Yeah.
that have this capacity to make introductions to everyone, and that even provided some examples about how, through one or two people, the connectedness of everyone in that startup community through those super nodes is really valuable. Let's kind of turn to maybe a more dirty topic, if you will, and that's metrics, or as you describe in the book, the measurement trap. a lot of you go into great detail about some of the challenges around how to measure progress in a startup community, and you're pretty upfront that there's really no specific manual on how to build or measure progress. So, so maybe you could start first by talking about what is the measurement trap, and how falling into this trap can be detrimental to a startup community overall health. And then secondly, what general best practices can a community follow to prevent falling into the measurement trap?
Mm, this is a fun one for me. Yeah, I think you can probably pick up on some passion in that chapter. I just think there are so many critical errors done in this work, and believe me, I come from a data background, you know, and I think this goes broader than measurement. Like, we still don't understand what drives an ecosystem very well, and I think acknowledging that our understanding of all this is limited is an important first step, just period, across the board. When you approach this as a scientific discipline, you're setting yourself up for failure, whether you realize it or not. So with the measurement trap, okay, so the whole measurement trap idea is basically, we believe the most important factors for an ecosystem success are intangible in nature. They're generally these things I just talked about. Relationships, the quality of relationships, the system structure, the other overall network dynamics, the culture and the mindset of the people involved that underpin all of that, right? That's really tough to measure. So what ends up happening is that we end up designing strategies around things that are less important but are easier to measure, like the number of startups or venture capital flows, right? Understanding that venture capital flows are what we're actually trying to look at from that. It's a proxy for something else, often a poor proxy, but it's not treated as thus. And so if that's a metric, then you're going to design around that. Another classic one is around jobs created. So it's something that it's tangible, you can count it, you can tie it back to something. But I would push back on those metrics for a couple of reasons. First of all, the types of companies that we're talking about here, high growth companies, it's not even the direct jobs that really matter anyway. There's this multiplier effect, right? So, 20 jobs at a very high wage, high tech business in your community produces a lot more jobs than 20 jobs at just your run-of-the-mill restaurant, right? And so understanding that the direct jobs that you're trying to count anyway, that's not even the right measure. But it's really, entrepreneurs aren't thinking about jobs. They're thinking about, or at least as a primary consideration, they're thinking about succeeding, growing their business. The jobs are an outcome of that business scaling. But if you design incentives around job creation, right, that might not be the right programming for the entrepreneur, right? So we want to focus on what is helping the entrepreneur succeed in their business, and knowing that a step removed from that is the thing that we might care about as an economic development authority, right? And I have deep sympathy for this process, because those individuals have to be accountable for the programs they're funding, right? They have bosses, they have other funding sources that want to see ROI. And so they're latching on to the thing that feels the easiest. And so it's not just that we're measuring the wrong things, it's that when we measure the wrong things, it can guide our strategies into useless or even harmful approaches. And that's really what this measurement trap is all about. The final thing I'll say about this chapter, which really kind of stoked the passion or the anger, or whatever you want to call it, is this obsession with rankings. I hate rankings so much. And I get why people do it. It's fun, maybe even, but the best comparison, look, I've built these dashboards. I continue to use them, cross city dashboards. It's really to provide me with a base case and really raise more questions than answers, the things I want to try to poke around if I'm trying to understand a city. But the best comparisons aren't you versus another city. It's you 5 years ago or 10 years ago. So it can be helpful, but it's part of a broader strategy. Don't look at those things as a silver bullet.
Yeah.
And that's really, I could go on, but that's more or less, what the measurement trap is about, and what kind of motivated that.
Well, and I appreciate the fact that you do provide several different sort of frameworks to sort of think about this, because to your point, there are a variety of stakeholders, from funders to economic development agencies and so forth, that want to be able to somehow justify funds or resources in this capacity. And I know, Techstars does has a service where they can actually go into a community and sort of provide, an assessment of sort of the health of that community. Do you find from the frameworks you provided, like, any ones that you would recommend people sort of maybe if they're trying to educate, a stakeholder or something that you would recommend over others?
Yeah. So I would say, well, the first thing I would say is, does it need to be macro or micro? Are you trying to understand the effectiveness of a program,
Mm.
or are you trying to understand the overall dynamics in your city or region? Right. So, for example, if you're funding, I don't know, let's say an entrepreneurial support organization, which is built around events and programming. A macro figure of startups in your city or jobs create, like, that's not it. That's not capturing that. There are too many other things going on, right? What you want to know is, well, this program, the suite of programs is designed to help entrepreneurs do something, right? These types of entrepreneurs do something. So measure that.
Mm.
There are easy ways to do that. Even better if you're tracking those things over time. So did some kind of a speaker series or a networking series, did it have the intended effect of creating relationships? You can gather information on the people who attended and then talk to them later and ask them, hey, we know the output is that 50 people attended. We want to know 6 months down the line, did that have any impact for you? And notice I said 6 months. That's how long it takes for a lot of these things to fire up, right? And so thinking about it in that way. The second thing I would say about some of this more, what is the state of play here? Again, as someone steeped in data and models and econometrics, it's actually just talking to people, doing structured interviews, surveying, capturing, capturing themes about what's working, what's not, who's effective, maybe what's not as effective, that will tell you a lot about the health and vibrancy of an ecosystem. I mean, I've visited so many places through my work and through the writing, and if you talk to I don't know, let's call it a dozen or so of the right people, you have a pretty good sense of what's going on. Now you need to dive deeper and explore different themes, but it doesn't take that long, assuming you're talking to the right people. And that's one of the other challenges with some of these assessments that go on and rankings, is that they're open surveys, right? It matters who you talk to, actually. It's not just any number of random people who answer the survey. It's that you need to talk to the key actors. So there is a hierarchy within these networks. So that's just my point is, getting clear on what it is you want to know. Is it about a program? Is it about overall health? Don't forget that the macro level, the easier that the data is to access, the less useful it is for understanding. Spend time talking to people over it. Well, I guess it's not over indexing, but index highly on entrepreneurs, not on the institutional actors. They think they know generally, and they're usually wrong. One final thing I'll say, through this work that we've done in a number of cities, we're asking people to recommend other founders that we should talk to. And what will define as a success, the bar for that will vary based on the location, but it can be fairly low. If we're talking about tech and tech-enabled companies, we might say, it has employed either 20 people or has raised one round of institutional capital or something along those lines. It doesn't have to be like this huge thing. And this happens every single time. There are so many more of those companies than anyone realizes. Even some of the most connected people don't realize how much is actually going on in the community. But the entrepreneurs aren't surfacing. They're not linking up, either because they don't find the support mechanisms useful or they don't know about it. And that's really what our job is. The way we handle these situations at Techstars specifically, we're using them as a community building event. It's not a document that you drop off on someone's desk in Split Town. It's a means to drive engagement and to bring people together.
That's great advice. You highlight several sort of guiding principles in the book beyond sort of being a founder first startup community. Can you speak about some of these principles and maybe highlight, how these are sort of embedded values and norms in a successful or healthy startup community?
Yeah, so founder first, underscores a lot of this stuff, but I'll say specifically about, like, let's not forget what this is about. There are some big egos in this space. In fact, there's a joke that I heard recently. Instead of ecosystem builders, it's ecosystem builders. That's fine. Everyone has an ego. That's what makes us interesting as humans. But one of the challenges is that we have overlapping missions and overlapping funding streams, and sometimes those resources are scarce, and that can lead people to compete against each other, which harms entrepreneurs, right? And so try to have this thought in your head as much as possible. Does this help entrepreneurs? Do I know to be true, or do I believe that to be true? If I have doubts, then to go find out. One really tangible way, I mean, this can surface through a lot of different ways, but if an entrepreneur asks you for advice, for example, just say, I don't know. I don't, I don't have the something you don't know the answer to, say, I don't know. I might be able to find that out for you. That's like a sneaky way of putting founders first, because you're saying, well, does me in this moment being vulnerable and saying, I don't know something, that's putting the founder first rather than my ego first. And then, but there are these bigger issues we talked about competition and that sort of thing. Give first is a concept that, really originated from Brad Feld. I think it's his overall philosophy in business and life, and it's what makes him so beloved by people who know him well and people who are observing him from afar because he lives it. It's not just generosity. This concept has a specific meaning. Give first means help people without the expectation of receiving something in return immediately, right? You're not being transactional, which I think is a relief in this work. People in my network, we're constantly helping each other, and I'm not keeping score. I'm sure there's plenty of people who do a lot more for me than I do for them, and vice versa. We're just doing it in service of this thing that we believe that entrepreneurs provide a better future for our society, and that by being a part of the community, we're all helping out in our own way, and it's nourishing us as well. So we're taking a very positive sum view. And so that's a really lens in life in general. I think a lot of our relationships, you wouldn't play that game with your children, right? You owe me kind of thing. So maybe some parents, I don't know. Right now I'm feeling my kids owe me a lot. But it's just a better way to do things, right? And part of the reason why it's necessary is that things need to move quickly and informally. You need to help. It's like basically, if you're sharing your network, you're sharing ideas, you're giving feedback to people, you're never too busy to have 5 minutes for someone. Um, and just realizing that, you don't need to hang on to all that knowledge and information you hold, or those key relationships. Like, unlock those for other people, and just try to be helpful. And that permeates sort of like, all of this stuff. About how we think and how to approach this work. There's a whole bunch of other principles in the book. If you want to call out any of them in particular, we can do that. But in general, I would say all of those principles in the book are about being positive sum, remembering what you're in it for, being helpful for others in any way that you can, even if the answer is, I don't know, not today, maybe in the future. I'll leave on one point, which I love. I'm a big fan of Rick Tarosi, who's sort of legendary in the Portland startup community. He would be so embarrassed to hear me say that, but he's one of these people. He just, he gives and gives, and he has this great YouTube talk, a TED talk on YouTube called Collecting and Connecting Dots. And he's basically saying, look, I've got 20 minutes for everyone. Most times I have nothing I can do for you in that moment, but I've collected the dot. That's you and your story and your needs and your priorities. And 8 months down the road, I now see a connection that needs to be made to you. And then I make that connection happen. That's really what community building is all about, in the essence of what Rick is saying.
Yeah. Oh, and it's so generous with his time in terms of working with anybody.
Well, right on cue, Joe. Same person.
Yeah,
same personality in Eugene.
Absolutely. Well, maybe one more question, then I'll open up for our audience to ask you questions. I'm curious, just in terms of the current COVID-19 environment, have you seen any sort of evidence of adaptivity in startup communities with this environment, and or how do you foresee sort of the future of startup communities based on what we're going through right now?
Well, first, let me say no one knows what's going to happen. We're all going to be wrong in surprising ways. And that's the nature of this stuff. But I think I have some ideas. The first thing I'll say about communities is that I feel like communities will be stronger than ever. To use a concept from the mafia, like, I guess this is a good, The Godfather, like we're going to the mattresses for a few years, like we're in hiding. And I don't know about you, but a lot of my community engagement for a while started to feel like an obligation. There was so much of it. I lived in London most of the last 5 years. I'm now back in the United States, in California. But I lived, London is a really difficult place to navigate, but it was an hour from where most of the startup activity was and where I lived. I have young children. It was a big deal. It took a lot of planning, right? And it felt like I was going to miss out on this thing, and so it started to kind of weigh me down a little bit. But now I have a lot of gratitude. I'm going to have more gratitude for that connecting and physical space. And I think it'll be more intentional. I think we've learned how to maintain connections with people virtually, even build them. I'm surprised at the ability to build new relationships through this medium. At first, I didn't think it was possible, but I actually do think it's possible now. I still don't think that there's a substitute for that coming together. I just think it will be more intentional. And so I'm excited about that. What I will say about, I guess, the geography of entrepreneurship, I don't believe that it's going to be, this complete scattershot. There's no more urban agglomeration, and founders and teams are distributed throughout the mountain ranges. And, there's going to be some of that. I don't think it's going to be 5 days a week required in the office kind of thing, but co-location will continue to matter. Agglomeration will continue to matter. I do think it does open up more possibilities for that longer tail. I think people have left those places like San Francisco, and they're not coming back, right? That's been proved out. So I think what will end up happening is places where things were already happening, you'll see more of it. But I just don't see how, outside of those people who have already made it in life, this idea of working from these remote locations, and flying in when you need to, that just doesn't work for regular people. So I'm curious, but less aggressive about how things will be distributed in the future.
That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. Well, let's open up for Q&A here. If you have a question for Ian, go ahead and open up. I unmuted people, so you can unmute yourself and go ahead and ask a question. Can everyone unmute or not? Maybe I did not unmute.
Did I put everyone to sleep? Should I do stand up? Joe's got a guitar.
Let's see. Now try that. If you have a question.
Hey, Ian, thank you so much for coming out tonight. I did have a question after hearing you talk about the measurement trap. That's actually one of my favorite chapters of the book. I really enjoy it. And it's something that I personally am kind of like trying to come out of myself, is just measuring things quantitatively. And it's really difficult to do that being in a complex system. But you kind of talked about the inputs that are important, and they're really relational. And I was wondering, how do you foster inputs like faith and trust in relationship and hope, and let those things spur the innovation?
Wow. I've been out talking about this books, I guess, since July, and that is probably one of the best questions I've ever had. I love that question. I feel like you really get it. Wow. I think a few things. So first of all, it's when the best way to change behavior and sort of the values and mindset, those things you talked about, faith and hope, is when other people around you are acting in that way. Unlike information, which can travel great distances quickly, social media, we've seen how information or disinformation can travel far and wide quickly. Behavior and sort of mental models don't change in that way. They change over short distances and proximity with repeated interactions. And so we really are a product of our environment in that way. So if the leaders in your community, if you're an entrepreneur, you're naturally looking to other entrepreneurs for guidance. If they're behaving in that virtuous way, you are more likely to adopt those values and norms as well. If those things are lacking in your community, and you, to pull in the faith card, I guess, if you're a prophet and you see that there's a more virtuous way to live, you should be that change. And you should find other people who want to be a part of that community with you. You don't have to get everyone on board. And in fact, in many communities, there's a core nucleus of people who do get it. They're disassociated with a lot of the resource providing industry, but over time, with some success and some persistence, that can build and become its own center of gravity and a resource attractor. But that requires that long-term commitment. So, getting back to how you measure those kinds of things, it's why we emphasize it's why we spend time gathering that qualitative information from people who deeply understand what's going on. It's why we capture information on established relationships, including mentoring relationships. We don't want to know who you're connected to on LinkedIn. We want to know who's advised you along the way, and we want to know something about them, right? In lots of communities, there's just nowhere to go. And it's always like a state-funded, well-intentioned, state-funded innovation center or something that just isn't relevant, doesn't have that kind of the right mindset. It's more about relationships with the bureaucracy than with effectiveness with entrepreneurs. And so those are the kind of things we look for. Like when I was talking about earlier, who's influential and what are they like? I guess to kind of short circuit this, you show me who the leaders are in a community, I'll tell you the state of affairs in that community if I spend some time with them. That's all you need to know. And in fact, that's why we take a hierarchical approach to our assessment work, because we know that once you figure out what's going on at that high level, you know everything you need to know.
Great. Other questions?
Yeah, I would love to follow up, Ethan. That was a great question. My question for you, Ian, is what makes creating traction in the entrepreneurship community so much more difficult than maybe many other communities that the rest of us are a part of?
Great question. I think it's simply because success takes time, because you don't have a lot of control over what's happening, right? So I've said the word success so many times, but it's I really want to emphasize it. We talk about, there's actually a chapter on this. I forget already what's in this book, but there's a chapter where we talk about averages, not outliers, and you would be, well, maybe you wouldn't be surprised, but if you had a home run success tomorrow in Eugene, and it was led by people who cared about the community, were clearly building community along the way, and had every intention to recycle that back into the next generation of founders, that one event can change everything, right? But it is, you have no idea when that's going to happen, right? It can happen anywhere. In fact, there are outliers all over the world of, wow, that's an unlikely place for that to occur. How could you reverse engineer that? Like, you can't. There's so many things that are outside of the control. And I think that's it, right? The dopamine hits are few and far between. And a lot of, founder communities are about, like, it's more about therapy because it's so hard. I mean, failure, financial hardship, family's fault. My own parents, separated because of failed entrepreneurship. My mother just couldn't take it anymore. And I get it, and so I don't know, that's not the most uplifting community to be a part of all the time. And like I say, those feedback cycles just take time, and that's a way to lose momentum. And that's why I think it makes it hard. I mean, a couple of other specific things, entrepreneurs maybe don't understand the value of being collaborative with other people. They're obsessed with their idea. A lot of entrepreneurs are introverts. I can relate to that for sure. But I think about that as a big picture kind of thing.
Other questions?
Can I actually follow you up? I would just hear what you were saying about, like, a lot of entrepreneurs being introverts, and some people I've spent time around in the past who were also entrepreneurs. I noticed that about them, but I also noticed they were in a lot of ways adverse to being around other people. And I was wondering, is there a good way to, like, provide, I don't know what term I would use, maybe like some grease to help them more cohesively spend time around other people without having socially awkward issues get in the way, kind of thing?
Yeah, that's great. I think it's about meeting people where they are and building that one-to-one relationship and trust. In the book, we talk about the need for community building to be way more than award ceremonies and cocktail parties. Not everyone's into that. Not everyone drinks. Not everyone likes to be around a room full of people. In fact, I think the bigger the room, the more I drink, which tells me that I don't like being in those environments. But in the work, I can say at Techstars, like, our ecosystem building work, we have I have only one mandate for the local teams that are out in those communities building connectivity on a day-to-day basis. It's called 100 Founders in 100 Days, and the whole notion is I don't care if it's 100 or 200, whatever. The point is, I'm trying to say the most important part of this job is to go and meet founders one-to-one and understand who they are and what they need. And from there, relationships form and connection points can be made. There are, I think, more accommodating aggregation points. Like we've tried things like Open Coffee Club, which is at a time of day that maybe feels a little more approachable for people that might be more introverted. I find that mornings are better, and it's just free coffee. It's the same time every week. A couple of other examples I know from some entrepreneurs in Boulder who have had success. I have breakfast every Thursday at 8 a.m. at this restaurant. If you're an entrepreneur and you want to come ask me questions, stop by. I think those kind of things. But I guess more or less what I'm saying is that it's about meeting those. And for me, the root of all of this is establishing those bonds one-to-one, and then looking for ways to pipe in value to those individuals from there.
Chloe, I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah, thanks for coming to talk, Ian. I have a quick question about, in the book, you briefly talked about the importance of diversity. Can you speak a little bit more to that? In addition, how do you think organizations and corporations can increase diversity?
Yeah, a lot on that. So we talk about, this book is about complex systems. We use complex systems to explain the characteristics and behaviors of ecosystems. And complexity in complex situations, which you can interpret as unclear objective, right? Subjective matter definitions of success, no playbook. We know overwhelmingly that having diverse viewpoints, diverse perspectives actually gets us to better outcomes rather than more experts, right? So we want diversity. Now, when we talk about diversity, especially now, we're talking about things like gender identity, racial identity, any number of things, but it's the whole package, right? Those things affect how our mental models, how we think and behave, right? And so we want to welcome as much of that as we can into our startups, solving complex problems, our startup communities. Also, when we lack diversity, especially in entrepreneurship now, we're not only are we getting suboptimal outcomes with innovation, we're not focusing on the right things as well, because the people who are tackling challenges they're often tackling challenges that they have faced themselves. And so when we don't have this inclusive approach, which is, to me, is much more than saying everyone is welcome, I think that is a naive view that doesn't acknowledge the fact that saying your doors are open and expecting people from marginalized groups or from people who are self-organizing into networks that aren't from those power structures. And those power structures can fall along a bunch of dimensions, right? It's not just, old white guys, right? It's people, it's based on school, previous employer. Some communities I've been in, it matters what high school you went to, right? In Africa, there's there are certain tribes, these go back generations, that people just won't work together and can be discriminated based on that. So there are any number of these dimensions. And so what I would say is that if you're in a position of power, it's not just saying, oh, we're welcoming to you. It's being active in that inclusion and going out and reaching out to those networks and not just supporting them and not just supporting what they're doing, but bringing them into your own network. That takes a lot of work. And so I feel like we're at a moment where these discussions are happening more so than they did in the past. It feels like there's momentum behind this that's lasting, and that's great. But I think I feel like a lot of organizations are scrambling right now to try to have surface level responses. And so, but it's early days, and it feels like something has shifted permanently, and I'm happy to see that. But overall, diversity is absolutely essential for all those reasons that I stated, far beyond reasons of fairness, justice, and humanity. It's there are core economic reasons for caring. Great question. Thanks.
I know we're coming to the end. I saw Sam, you had a question, and then that maybe will be all the time we have. So Sam,
I'd be happy to go a few minutes over.
Okay, well that'd be great. We have three hands raised right now. So
yeah,
is that okay?
I'd be happy to answer all the remaining questions,
okay.
and I'll try. Maybe you could signal me and say stop talking.
Okay.
So I'm giving long answers.
I will start in order. Sam, go ahead and ask your question for Ian.
Yes, thank you so much. I really appreciate your book, Ian, and the dynamic that you took. In terms of simplifying things down for me, what mattered most out of it was that you really embodied what I would call the ideal community model. And not just in terms of like the complexity that you engage, but really the vulnerability that you promote and the inclusion mindset as well. Off of your question, Chloe, I feel was very powerful. And the one thing that I was a bit surprised on was that you mentioned how you don't want to over-engineer your engagement in the community, and that micromanagement kind of side of things. I agree, but I'm curious, what is that fine line between over-engineering the engagement in like a programmatic sense, but also in terms of keeping things as open-ended? What's that balance?
Yeah, great question. I think let me answer it differently. It's having the humility to say, I don't know all there is to know about this. I'm okay with an outcome that's different than the one that I have envisioned. As long as you have the curiosity and the commitment to follow that to where it needs to go, what data is telling you, what the signposts are telling you. I mean, anyone who has been an entrepreneur or who has worked with entrepreneurs or has done anything innovation related, or who has been a parent or any number of things where complex processes are involved will tell you, wow, that thing that was needed was not at all on my radar. I mean, I just talked about it with the writing of this book. That's the interesting thing. We set out to do one thing. It was clear that we were on the wrong path. And instead of plowing ahead stubbornly and engineering the outcome that we wanted, that would have made our publisher happy, which would have made our spouses happy, and all these other things, we actually said, no, we're on a different mission. And so, what's the fine line? I think it's that stance of saying, I'm willing to persist until I get this right. And I'm okay knowing that the thing that I think the answer is could be very wrong.
Lauren, you had a question? Lauren.
Yeah, thank you. I loved that answer. I was curious if you could touch on, for those of us that are students, what one or two key things are to building an entrepreneurial ecosystem on a university campus, and how that might differ from a city or other community.
Am I allowed to say get off of campus as much as possible? Is that allowed? Fine. Universities are great, but they're limiting by design, right? They're designed in a siloed format. This school, this department within that school, everyone wants to have their own entrepreneurship program. Everyone's got to be this or that, or no, this is in the business school. We can't talk to those people. Never mind the fact that some of the highest participation in entrepreneurship today is people coming out of humanities and social sciences. So I can kind of rant about that for a while. But I think maybe what I'll double click on that point is to say that right now, well, entrepreneurship is a process of creation. and there are a lot of creative people in your community who might be studying different things from you. And those differentiated, those diverse combinations produce, novel outputs, right? Interesting things happen when you're collaborating with people who think differently from you, who have different training from you. Number one. Number two, if you really feel committed to, you're curious about entrepreneurship, or you think you want to, work at a tech company or something, before you found a company, unless you're really good, I would go and work for a startup in your local community. There are amazing resources in Eugene. I've already called him out, but I think Joe is one of your Bradfelds in that community. And, get to know him and see what he thinks, overload his inbox and knock on his front door at odd hours and ask him for advice. He will give it to you. Sorry, Joe. But I'm serious. Campus it's an ecosystem unto itself. And the best startup communities in university towns have, it's not the university is here and the startup community is here. It's that there are good linkages between them.
Great. All right, couple more, and then we'll leave for Ian to get to dinner time. Alden, go ahead. You had your hand raised.
Sure, thank you. Well, first of all, Ian, I couldn't agree more. Joe has been beyond incredible asset in starting my venture and the process of doing so. But my question for you, kind of touching on that subject, is how do I share my connections and experiences if no one's asking?
So are you engaging with, are you engaging with other entrepreneurs and they're not asking for advice from you, or what?
I believe that I engage with a fair amount of entrepreneurs, but I could definitely be engaging with more.
So how do they know about you?
I don't know if they do.
Yeah. So that's part of the issue, right? Is getting out there. People with, maybe with more, experience and have some wisdom to offer the world. You can do this through a bunch of different channels now. Obviously, you can write blogs. You could set up some kind of a group, right? You can do any number of things, which lets people know that you're out there, that you're interested in this, that you have something to offer, and that you want to create a community of other people who are interested in the same things and want to grow and create something together.
And I'll just speak there too, Alden. I know we have a founders student-led group, so it's very much founder-led, students meeting students. So it's been on sort of hiatus again because of the pandemic, but do look for that, because we'd love to get people like yourself, Alden, connecting with other fellow students. So two more questions. Jacqueline.
Hi, Ian. Thanks so much for the really interesting conversation so far. I think you might have touched on it a little bit when answering Lauren's question, but I know both in the book and in what you've been talking about tonight, the importance of entrepreneurial leaders who have like a long-term vision and who stay in the community long-term is really important. And I was wondering how that applies to a university setting where students cycle in and out every 4 years.
Yeah, good question. So, I feel like the connection point for any startup community is around establishing empathy. And we establish empathy through commonality, right? It's that thing, once a duck, always a duck. I was about to say, university is one of the few opportunities in life where there's equanimity, right? Those people you meet, you're all on even footing to begin. I don't know of too many. You're going to have a wake-up call, by the way, all of you, when you graduate and you move to a city or something and no one knows you and you're like, oh, damn, how do I get known? Yeah, so it's that, like, it's having that common connection, right? You have that connection point. Presumably you have some pride for your university and you want to connect with other people around that. So I guess I would flip it around and say that I think it's one of the best places for those sparks to fly. And then I would just plea, once you have moved on and you're doing other things, look for ways to give back to the community. It's really easy, and help people in ways that maybe support you didn't have when you were a student.
Candy, last question, Candy.
Thanks so much for staying a little later, Ian. I guess my question does kind of relate to the last couple of questions. I'm interested in if you have seen kind of a generational gap with people that have more experience and then really young entrepreneurs, and maybe even people that don't know that they're entrepreneurs yet. And if you've seen any programs that kind of bridge the gap of generations.
Which gap do you mean specifically? Like a knowledge gap, or
more a communication gap, or even just approaching somebody with more experience if you're someone with less experience?
Oh, okay. Well, first of all, let me say that I think don't overlook the peer relationships, right? So much of mentoring is not, oh, I am older and more experienced, so do as I say. Some of that knowledge of people who have been successful entrepreneurs is stale and doesn't apply. In so many communities, the people who have had success made their money in industries that just don't apply to today, right? So don't assume experience equals relevant knowledge or wisdom, right? So first of all, it's nailing that. The second, the peer, not overlooking the peer dynamics. Secondly, I would say that I believe that people in your generation are incredibly, I know this is so anecdotal, but I just feel like you're very creative and entrepreneurial in spirit and more collaborative than I think even my generation. I'm not that much older. I won't say how much older. Some of that has to do with industrial structure, right? Like, it wasn't that long ago that we were organized primarily on farms and in factories, and there was a different way of thinking collaboratively and building communities. We're just seeing now the power that technology, the internet, is unlocking for communities. Some of that's been bad, but I think one of the highest growth areas in tech is you're going to see these jobs over and over and over as head of community, people who are managing the communities of people who are building around products. So I think there's that. But the final thing I'll say about how do you approach someone who's maybe more experienced, or, is take the time to know who they are, what they've done, why you want to talk to them, and so it's sort of, nothing magic about that, just showing up prepared, that you did your homework, that you're being mindful of their time, also having something to offer, right? That's been monumental for my career, is to give first, is to have something of value, not really looking for an exchange, but just being an interesting person with a perspective. And finally is using the information and networks that you do have to find who the helpful people actually are. So in Eugene, it's probably, I know with Joe and with Kate, like with those two nodes in your network, you're going to be able to find who the helpful people are in that community. And it's finding those people wherever you are, and getting an understanding of, hey, I'm thinking about becoming a founder. Who should I talk to in this city? Or, I don't know, I was interested in design, but I wasn't, I wanted to do web design, but I'm not sure. Do you know anyone that I could talk to about that? And those people who are helpful, who are natural community builders, will find ways to connect you up. So, yeah.
That's a great way to end today's conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ian. We all want to thank you. Virtual applause, thank you. And if you haven't yet read The Startup Community Way, do go to ianhathaway.com where Ian has various places where you can buy the book. So with that, thank you all, and I'll have a good night.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you.
My pleasure to be here. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.